Warren Rivers, 56 years old, 35 years on death row. Rivers was found guilty of killing 11-year-old Carl Nance Jr. in May 1987. The boy had ridden his bicycle to a nearby shop to run an errand for his mother, according to testimony from the 1988 trial. The youngster was taken into an abandoned house south of the city on May 3, 1987, where he was then beaten, essayed, and stabbed, according to the evidence. Days after being detained, Rivers eventually told homicide detectives that he had slain the youngster. In addition to the evidence presented in the initial trial, the prosecution demonstrated that he had written stories in journals while incarcerated about essay, murder, and sadism. Rivers had previously served time for a different essay while still a minor. David Wood, 66 years old, 30 years on death row. In 1987, a number of young women in the age range of 14 to 24 went missing from El Paso, Texas. The bodies of 6 women were soon found in shallow graves in the desert, and the murders became known as the Northeast Desert Murders. American serial killer and rapist David Wood, sometimes known as the Desert Killer, murdered at least 6 women in El Paso, Texas between May and August 1987 before concealing their bodies in the desert. Despite his denials, he was found guilty and given the death penalty for the killings of Ivy Williams, Desiree Whitley, Karen Baker, Angelica Frausto, Rosa Maria Cayo, and Dawn Smith. The state provided ample proof of Wood's impending risk throughout the trial's punishment phase. The state presented evidence that Wood had previously been found guilty of essay of a child and indecency with a child. He was sentenced to 5, 20, and 50 years in prison for those offenses respectively. A sex worker testified that on September 19, 1987, Wood approached her as she was waiting for a bus and offered her money in exchange for sex. She entered Wood's vehicle and instructed him to find a hotel. Instead, he drew a knife and threatened to kill her while also essaying her. As the truck was still driving, the woman leaped out and hurt herself. Another lady testified that Wood grabbed her when she was 13 years old and essayed her under a bridge as she was walking home. A third lady claimed that he approached her when she was 12 years old and requested her assistance in locating his dog. At last, he grabbed her and proceeded to essay her. Another woman said that when she was 23 years old, Wood and another man gave her a ride home from work. She claimed that after arriving to some apartments, both males got out. Wood returned to the truck by himself and began to drive. He stopped by the side of the road and essayed her. Jose Rivera, 61 years old, 29 years on death row, for the murder of 3-year-old Daniel Luis Blanco in Brownsville, Texas, while performing or attempting an aggravated essay. Rivera was found guilty and given the death penalty in May 1994. Veronica Zavala moved into the Brownsville flat close to Daniel Luis Blanco's family in June 1993. Soon after, Zavala grew close to Carolina Blanco, the victim's mother. In the morning of July 9, 1993, Carolina and her 2 sons were at home. Luis left the apartment briefly before entering it again with Zavala. Zavala had given Luis a popsicle, which he was holding. She requested to use the phone. After she took the call, Zavala opened the door and exited with Luis. Many calls were temporarily taking up Carolina Blanco's time in the meanwhile. Carolina went to search for Zavala and Luis around 5 minutes after they had departed. Neither Zavala nor Luis could be found, according to her. After that, Carolina contacted the police, who then started looking for Luis. Zavala went back to her flat without Luis around 3 hours later. According to testimony from Carolina Blanco, Zavala was biting on a popsicle stick that her son had earlier that day. Zavala became furious and denied knowing anything about Carolina's son, and she refused to give any details. On the morning of July 10, 1993, a tiny pond in the nearby Lincoln Park was where Luis's naked body was discovered floating face down. The water close to his body included his checkered shorts and white tennis shoes. A single knot was used to secure a ligature made from the victim's underwear waistband around his neck. police discovered indications that Lewis had also been essayed. Despite spending 18 to 36 hours in the water, pathologist Dr. Marguerite DeWitt testified that the victim did not drown. Instead, ligature strangulation was the cause of death. The child's father, Alejandro Blanco, testified that Luis had been in excellent health on the morning of the murder. In a statement she made on July 10, 1993, Zavala admitted to her involvement in the murder and named José Alfredo Rivera as a suspect. Rivera also confessed to strangling the boy and using a finger to essay him. He admitted to this in 2 written statements on July 10th and a videotaped oral confession on July 11th. The child's underpants had been cut off and tied around his neck with a single knot. The time of death was compatible with the time indicated by Rivera, and various other facts of Rivera's confession were supported by independent evidence in addition to the child's strangulation and injuries. Co-defendant Veronica Zavala is currently serving a life sentence after being charged with capital murder as well. Gerald Eldridge, 59 years old, 29 years on death row. Eldridge was found guilty of killing Chirisa Bogani and her mother Cynthia Bogani. Both Cynthia's and Eldridge's 9-year-old son Terrell and Cynthia's then-boyfriend Wayne Dodson were shot, but they survived the attack, where the two were killed. At Eldridge's capital murder trial, Terrell Bogani testified. He informed the jury that his father had shot his sister between the eyes at close range after he had kicked through the door. He also talked about how his father had stood over him and fired at his head during both the shooting of Dodson and his own shooting. He claimed that the gunshot entered his shoulder as he turned his head. In addition, he claimed to have seen Eldridge chasing after his mother as she fled the apartment. She was shot outdoors. Eldridge refused to watch the penalty phase of his 1994 trial. Before passing judgment on the death penalty, a jury in Harris County took about 30 minutes to deliberate. Documents stated Eldridge was convicted in 1985 to 8 years in jail for attempted murder for shooting a man 8 times. After being freed 3 years later, he was sent back to jail in 1990 for abusing his son. Records showed he attempted to kill the youngster after receiving his release 4 months later. Larry Hatton, 49 years old, 27 years on death row. Isaac Jackson, who was 5 years old, was shot while he was in bed with his mother at their Corpus Christi residence in 1995. Hatton was found guilty of the murder. Tabitha Thompson, the mother of the boy, was hit 4 times by bullets, but she managed to survive. The young boy was shot twice and passed away. According to court records, Hatton entered Isaac Robinson's residence, the child's father and Thompson's boyfriend, forced open a bedroom door, and then opened fire in vengeance for an upsurge in drug dealer fights. Hatton would later admit that he had planned to kill Robinson, but that he wasn't at home. On the appeal, Hatton unsuccessfully argued that a juror at his trial was biased in favor of the prosecution, since the juror knew Robinson and Hatton's stepfather, bought drugs from Robinson, and lied about his drug usage when asked about it. The jury allegedly lied when asked about the relationships during a court hearing, according to Hatton's appeal. The appeals court stated that there was substantial evidence. Hatton had admitted to wanting to kill Robinson, and Hatton had been positively identified as the shooter. Anthony Medina, 49 years old, 27 years on death row. On January 1, 1996, just after midnight, Medina, then 21 years old, drove past the Rodriguez home and fired into a group of kids and teenagers who were standing in the house's well-lit front yard. The young people were there for a New Year's Eve celebration, largely with family. At 5 to 7 feet from the ground and from only a few feet away from some of the victims, Medina shot into the crowd of people in the front yard. The home, a few cars, and 3 people were all hit by the bullets. An abdominal bullet pierced Rocio Pedroza. She made it through. The 2 people who were killed in the most direct line of Medina's bullets were David Rodriguez, 8 years old, and his sister Diane Rodriguez, 13 years old. David was killed by 2 wounds, one of which went through his brain and into his chest, the other through his arm. Injuries Diane received included a deadly one that entered her neck through her left shoulder and a non-fatal one that perforated her right breast. Medina was on probation for 6 felony offenses at the time of the shooting. Garcia White, 60 years old, 27 years on death row. White went to a crack home, which was an apartment in northeast Houston owned by 38-year-old Bonita Edwards, a widow with 2 kids, Burnett and Annette, who were both 16 years old. To the dismay of Edwards' daughters, who had attempted to move in with their grandmother out of fear, the flat was routinely used as a safe space for users. On November 30th, White arrived at the flat with the intention of using and having with Bonita, but when she declined, he became angry. Then, after getting a knife out, he repeatedly stabbed her, frightening her 2 girls. After essaying Annette in the bedroom, he stabbed her in the chest and slashed her throat. He then went to the bathroom and did the same to Burnett. After killing the girls, White wrapped a blanket around part of Annette's body and then stuffed a towel into Burnett's mouth before fleeing as swiftly as he could. The bodies weren't found until December 2nd, when King Solomon, Edward's worried boyfriend, went to the apartment to check on them. The triple homicide remained a cold case for 6 years, despite thorough investigations that failed to produce any plausible suspects. In an attempt to rob a Houston convenience store in July 1995, White and a friend called Tecumseh Manuel killed the clerk Hai Van Pham. Both men were detained after the murder, but Manuel later told police that White allegedly confessed to him about the 1989 murder of the Edwards family. He was then interrogated in connection with the triple homicide, and although he originally denied involvement, White eventually admitted guilt after seeing a section of Manuel's interview. Darlie Routier, 53 years old, 26 years on death row. Routier was found guilty of murdering her 2 young kids, Damon, age 5, and Devon, age 6. Devon and Damon were killed in Routier's home by a large kitchen knife, and Routier was stabbed in the arm and throat. Routier informed the police that the incident was caused by an unknown invader. The defense claimed that Routier had no justification for killing her kids, and that there were no witnesses, no confession, and no motivation in the case. The prosecution argued throughout the trial that Routier killed her sons because of the family's financial problems, that her injuries were self-inflicted, and that the crime scene had been fabricated. Carlos Trevino, 52 years old, 26 years on death row. Trevino, who was 21 years old at the time and a member of the Pistoleros street gang, encountered Linda Salinas, a student at Harlandale High School, on June 9, 1996. He had been released from jail a month earlier after serving time for an auto theft charge. On June 9, 1996, Linda, who was just 15 years old, was reportedly spotted getting into a car with a group of young guys, according to court records. Her partially dressed body was discovered in a creek the following day in Espada Park on the south side. She had been essayed and stabbed to death. Although 3 other people were found guilty of the murder as well, only Trevino was given the death penalty. Ramiro Ibara, 69 years old, 26 years on death row. Ibarra killed and essayed a 16-year-old Hispanic girl, Maria Zuniga, on March 6, 1987. The girl was attacked by Ibarra, which was a family friend, while she was caring for her 2 young nephews inside her home. Following an essay and beating, she was strangled with an electrical cable. Ibarra was found to have scratches on his face and torso when he was interrogated. Later, Ibarra's skin was found under the victim's fingernails. Once a judge suppressed some of the case's evidence, Ibarra was let go. Prosecutors were able to reopen the case almost 10 years later thanks to legislative improvements to the regulations governing the presenting of evidence. On October 10, 1996, Ibarra was taken into custody while residing in Bell County. Richard Vasquez, 44 years old, 24 years on death row. A jury found Vasquez guilty of capital murder in June 1999 for the March 5, 1998 death of Miranda Lopez, a toddler. Vasquez, who was 18 years old, shared a home with his parents, Brenda Lopez, his fiancée, their 4-month-old daughter Megan, and Miranda, Brenda's 4-year-old daughter. Vasquez had a significant heroin and cocaine addiction. Vasquez claims that he and Brenda argued all through the night of March 4th, during which he injected heroin and cocaine before passing out in the early hours of March 5th. At 10:30 a.m., Vasquez gave himself another heroin injection before driving Brenda to work between 11 a.m. and noon while the kids sat in the back seat. Vasquez became enraged with Brenda along the way since he had to keep an eye on the kids. After they got back home, Vasquez got upset because he could not find the drugs, and he admitted that even if the 4-year-old girl did nothing wrong, he hit her in the head. He instructed Miranda to go get a stool from his parents' room in order to wash her teeth. Vasquez asserted that Miranda fell to the ground when she returned with the stool. After brushing her teeth with toothpaste, he left the room. Miranda was lying face down in the sink when he returned. She continued falling down despite his repeated attempts to get her to stand. Around 1:30 p.m., he placed her on his parents' bed and dialed 911, informing the operator that Miranda was choking. Vasquez claimed Miranda bit him when he put his finger in her mouth to stop her from swallowing her tongue, and the little girl had blood on her nose and mouth. Miranda had a lump on the back of her head, obvious bruises on her back in different stages of healing, and bruising around her eyes which suggested a possible brain injury according to the paramedics. The neurosurgeon testified that the little girl had brain injuries that were equivalent to those she would have sustained had she been ejected from a car traveling 65 miles per hour. When Miranda was checked by SA nurse Lynn Box at 7 p.m., she was found to have significant bruising on her head, face, chest, hips, pelvis, genitalia, ankle, leg, shoulder, back, and arms. Some of these bruises were the results of wounds sustained in the previous 12 to 24 hours. Miranda's hips had bruises that were consistent with those that may result from being grabbed from behind while being essayed. The amount of cocaine in Miranda's bloodstream was possibly fatal, according to a blood analysis. It was 2 times the level at which an adult would die. Luis Perez, 61 years old, 24 years on death row. Construction worker and carpenter Perez has been on death row since a Travis County jury convicted him for the 1998 murders of Michelle Fulwiler, 30 years old, Cinda Barrs, 38 years old, and Barrs' 9-year-old daughter, Stacy Mitchell. On September 8, 1998, Mitchell, Fulwiler, and Barrs were discovered dead in their Barton Hills residence. Authorities claimed that Perez, a friend of Fulwiler, beat and strangled her after spending the night at her house. Then, after waiting until Mitchell got home from Barton Hill Elementary, he choked her. Perez killed Barrs by beating her to death with an iron tortilla skillet after she got back from work. Carrie Allen, 64 years old, 22 years on death row. Kiana Lachey Baker, the 2-year-old daughter of Allen's girlfriend, was essayed and murdered. Repeated hits to the child's chest and abdomen caused the death. Kim Jones, the mother of the little girl, who acknowledged previously hitting her daughter with a belt in the past, told police she had left for work that day and came home early when Allen called to indicate there was an emergency. The mother arrived to find the little girl dead on the floor. Near her body was a jar of Vaseline. When the ambulance arrived, Allen ran away but later surrendered. Rigoberto Avila Jr., 51 years old, 22 years on death row. In May 2001, Avila received a death sentence for the murder of Nicolas Macias, the 19-month-old son of his girlfriend. In February 2000, he contacted 911 to report that the child was not breathing while he was monitoring Nicolas and his girlfriend's other kid, who was 4 years old. According to court documents, the testimony of medical professionals supported the claims made at trial by El Paso County prosecutors that Avila stomped on Nicolas' stomach, causing the boy to suffer fatal blunt force injuries. According to the state and medics, only Avila could have killed Nicolas, notwithstanding the claims made by Avila's attorneys that the older child could have caused the injuries. Avila claimed in his initial testimony to police that he was in the other room when the older boy entered and informed him that he and Nicolas were wrestling and that he had put his hand over Nicolas' mouth when he stopped breathing. However, Avila claimed to have stepped on the child in a second statement to the police. Perry Austin, 64 years old, 21 years on death row. After admitting guilt to the murder of 9-year-old David Karim Kazmuz, Austin was given the death penalty. On August 19, 1992, David Kazmuz left his neighbor's yard and headed toward his house when he vanished. Austin had served almost a year of his parole after being found guilty of aggravated robbery, attempted essay, and essay in Dallas in 1978. In this case, family members were among the victims. He met Karim Kazmuz while working as a drug courier for a street gang in Houston. Austin believed Karim, who was 16 at the time, had stolen from him when some of the pills went missing. Austin killed Karim's younger brother in retaliation. Irving Davis, 41 years old, 21 years on death row. In El Paso, Texas, on June 4, 2001, Davis followed Melissa Medina, then 16 years old, as she left a party. Davis led her into a playground of an elementary school where he killed her by strangling and striking her in the head with an unidentified weapon. Additionally, Davis essayed her. Alejandro Betancourt stated in his deposition that he worked for the Anthony Independent School District's Maintenance Division. He and a colleague found Medina's body on the school grounds early on June 4, 2001. The tips of her fingers were severed and her face was black and swollen. Robert Robertson, 57 years old, 20 years on death row. Robertson asserted that he found his injured 2-year-old daughter Nikki on January 31, 2002, after she had fallen out of bed. For treatment, he brought her to Palestine Regional Medical Center. After that, she was brought to Children's Hospital in Dallas, where she passed away on February 1, 2002. Authorities detained Robert Robertson and charged him with capital murder in connection with his daughter's death. He was accused of violently shaking and abusing Nikki, causing severe injuries that ultimately led to her death. John Rubio, 43 years old, 20 years on death row. The 3 children of his common-law wife, Angela Camacho, Julissa Quesada, age 3, John Rubio, and Mary Jane, age 2, were beheaded on March 11, 2003, and Rubio was found guilty by a jury. Despite having fathered Mary Jane, John Allen Rubio treated all children as his own. Rubio acknowledged killing his kids and claimed he did so because he believed they were possessed by the spirit of his deceased grandma. He acknowledged to drowning, stabbing, and beheading Mary Jane Rubio, John Estefan Rubio, and Julissa Quesada. Rubio's brother phoned the police, who arrived at the family's apartment to find the youngsters dead. A large trash bag had been used to contain the 2 girls, and the little boy was on the bed. Walter Sorto, 46 years old, 20 years on death row. In the East End area of Houston, Texas, 2 women and 1 teenage girl were murdered in 2002. Edgardo Rafael Kubas Matamoros, a citizen of Honduras, Walter Alexander Sorto, a citizen of El Salvador, and Eduardo Navarro, a kid who was just 15 years old at the time of the crimes, were the 3 perpetrators. Esmeralda Alvarado, 15 years old, was a sophomore in the 10th grade at Lamar High School. She vanished on January 18, 2002, after leaving the home of her boyfriend. The 3 criminals abducted her, essayed her, then shot her in the head. Her body was found on January 22, 2002. The other murder victims, waiters Roxana Araceli Capulin, 24 years old, and Maria Moreno Rangel, 38 years old, worked at the El Mirador restaurant in the East End, which Capulin's family purchased in 1994. The bodies of the 2 women were discovered in Capulin's car on July 1st after they vanished on May 31, 2002. They had been shot to death and tape had been placed over their mouths and eyes. Tomás Cayo, 48 years old, 20 years on death row. The morning of December 11, 2001, Cayo was watching over his girlfriend's 2 girls. That afternoon, Destiny Flores, 3 years old, was discovered with more than 200 internal and external wounds, a 12-inch skull fracture, and signs of a brutal essay. During the trial, a medical examiner had testified that the child had been kicked, punched, and apparently bit several times. She sustained organ damage and rib fractures. Edgardo Kubas, 44 years old, 19 years on death row. The essay and shooting killings of Roxana Capulin, 24 years old, Teresa Rangel, 38 years old, and 15-year-old Esmeralda Alvarado on the east side of Houston resulted in the arrest of these trio in February 2003. They were identified as Walter Alexander Sorto, Edgardo Rafael Kubas, and Eduardo Navarro. Sorto has now been found guilty of killing Capulin and Rangel, who were kidnapped on June 1, 2002, from the restaurant where they both worked. Laura Ayala, 13 years old, who has been missing since March 10, 2002, and was originally identified as an I-45 victim, has also been connected to Sorto, Kubas, and Navarro after DNA evidence connected her to a drop of blood found in Kubas's father's SUV. They refused to talk about their role in the murder of Ayala and aren't facing any charges in this case. Anthony Francois, 55 years old, 19 years on death row. Anthony Quinn Francois was given the death penalty by a Harris County jury for the murder of his ex-girlfriend's little sisters. The murders of Ashley Patterson, 11 years old, and Brittany Patterson, 10 years old, on September 11, 2003, led to Francois' conviction. He was also charged with murdering another sister, 15-year-old Nakisha Patterson, but was never tried for that. After finding out that his ex-girlfriend, who was just 16 at the time, was seeing a boy who was closer to her own age, Francois claimed authorities he shot the girls in a fit of jealous wrath. He also hurt her mother and her. Andre Thomas, 40 years old, 18 years on death row. Thomas murdered Laura Boren, his estranged wife, his son, age 4, and her daughter, age 1, in Sherman, Texas in 2004. The two children's hearts were taken from their bodies after he hacked open the chests of all three victims. Thomas stabbed himself 3 times in the chest after killing the kids. He entered the living room and laid down next to Boren's body, expecting to pass away from his wounds. He put the victim's organs in his pockets after realizing he wasn't going to die and headed home. He put the organs in a bag and discarded them in the garbage when he got home. Thomas handed himself in to the Sherman Police Department, where he told the authorities that he believed God had ordered him to murder the victims. He claimed that he used a different knife to kill each victim because he believed that the victims contained devils. He reasoned that if the blood from the victims was allowed to mix, the demons might live. Thomas underwent chest surgery after being transported to the hospital. Harper Garland, 54 years old, 13 years on death row. Harper was given a death sentence after a jury deliberated for 3 hours before convicting him of fatally stabbing and strangling his 38-year-old girlfriend and her 2 daughters. For several months, Harper, who was then 40 years old, and Triska LaShawn Rose shared a condo in southwest Houston. Harper started stalking Triska and accusing her of cheating on him. In the end, on October 24, 2008, he tied her up, stabbed her, and then slashed her throat. He was detained for aggravated robbery in 1998 when the two were dating. After serving 9 years of a 40-year prison term, he was freed. After his release, the two were together for 7 months before her death. Brianna Robertson, 15 years old, and Maya Love, who was just 7 years old, were also strangled after being bound by Harper. Harper was not their biological father. Milum Blaine, 34 years old, 13 years on death row. When Milum was sentenced to 180 days in prison in 2008, he was just 19 years old. Milum had broken into a girl's home and searched through her possessions. He received a 6-month prison sentence after being charged with soliciting a child. Milum left the program 48 days into his sentence while on work release. He met Amora Carson's mother, Jessica Carson. They clicked right away and stayed together all the time. Milum thought Amora needed an exorcism a few weeks into the relationship because he believed she was possessed. Jessica was persuaded by him that Amora was evil. Amora was attacked by Jessica and Blaine. They used a claw hammer, resulting in shocking injuries, according to forensic pathologists. This exorcism ended with Amora's demise. Beginning at her head and ending at her toes, the infant's body bore 24 bite marks. Amora's brain was lacerated and her private parts were terribly torn. Amora sustained all of the wounds mentioned above while she was still alive. Demontrell Miller, 36 years old, 14 years on death row. Miller was found guilty in 2009 of killing his girlfriend's 2-year-old son. He killed the kid by beating him. Kellen Pinson, 2 years old, was murdered. The autopsy revealed that Benson died from blunt force trauma, contrary to Miller's claims that he discovered the child in the water and tried to revive him. Later, the police discovered bloodied clothing inside the residence. The death, according to the defense, was an accident. Paul Devo, 60 years old, 14 years on death row. In Travis County, Devo was facing capital murder charges in connection with the killings of Haley Faulkner, 15 years old, an ex-girlfriend's daughter, and Danielle Hensley, 17 years old, in the Johnston massacre. On August 24, 2007, Devo fatally shot bartender Michael Alfred, 41 years old, at O'Neill's Sports Tavern in Marble Falls. He then took a car to his ex-girlfriend Paula Marie Griffith's, 46 years old, Johnston residence. He murdered Griffith, Hensley, Faulkner, 48-year-old Jay Feltner, who was her boyfriend. Devo allegedly drove to his hometown of Long Island, New York, where he was apprehended on August 27 at the home of a former co-worker. According to a criminal complaint, Devo had car trouble on the way and killed Betty Jane DeHart, 81 years old, after sighting her car at DeHart's home in Greencastle, Pennsylvania. Melissa Lucio, 55 years old, 15 years on death row. Lucio is the first woman of Hispanic heritage to receive a death sentence in Texas. After the death of her 2-year-old daughter Mariah, who had injuries to her skull, contusions of the kidneys, lungs, and spinal cord, as well as scattered bruises that were in various stages of healing, she was found guilty of capital murder. While Lucio's defense contended that Mariah's death was brought on by a fall down the stairs 2 days earlier, prosecutors argued that Mariah's injuries were caused by physical abuse. Stephen Long, 52 years old, 17 years on death row. Long was convicted in DSA and strangulation of an 11-year-old girl. Cedric Ricks, 49 years old, 9 years on death row. Ricks was convicted in the stabbing death of his girlfriend and her 8-year-old son. Franklin Davis, 41 years old, 10 years on death row. Davis was convicted in the murder of a 16-year-old girl who had accused him of SA. Obel Cruz Garcia, 56 years old, 10 years on death row. Cruz Garcia was convicted in the murder of a 7-year-old. Naim Muhammad, 44 years old, 10 years on death row. Muhammad was convicted in the drownings of his 2 children. Jamie Cole, 53 years old, 12 years on death row. Cole was convicted in the shooting deaths of his wife and 15-year-old stepdaughter. Joseph Jean, 51 years old, 12 years on death row. He was convicted in the murders of 2 girls ages 16 and 17. Arely Escobar, 44 years old, 12 years on death row. Escobar was convicted in the SA and stabbing death of a 17-year-old girl. Travis Mullis, 37 years old, 12 years on death row. Mullis was convicted in the murder of his 3-month-old son. Demond Blunson, 54 years old, 7 years on death row. Blunson was convicted in the shooting deaths of his 21-month-old son and his girlfriend's 6-year-old boy. Amos Wells III, 33 years old, 7 years on death row. Wells was convicted in the shooting deaths of his 22-year-old pregnant girlfriend, her 10-year-old brother, and her mother in Fort Worth. William Hudson, 41 years old, 6 years on death row. Hudson was convicted in the murders of 6 people on a camping trip. The victims' ages ranged from 6 to 76. Jason De La Cerda, 46 years old, 5 years on death row. De La Cerda was convicted in the murder of his girlfriend's 4-year-old daughter. Isidro de la Cruz, 33 years old, 5 years on death row. He was convicted in the death of his ex-girlfriend's 5-year-old daughter, whose throat was cut during a home invasion. Howard Lewis, 56 years old, 5 years on death row. Lewis was convicted in the hanging death of his 16-month-old son. The child was found at the house of his grandmother, who was also killed. Ronald Haskell, 43 years old, 4 years on death row. Haskell was convicted in the shooting deaths of his ex-sister and brother-in-law in Spring. He also admitted to fatally shooting 4 of the couple's children, ages 4 to 13 years old. Taylor Parker, 31 years old, 1 year on death row. Parker was convicted in the death of Reagan Simmons Hancock after cutting out her unborn baby, who also died. Robert Satterfield, 42 years old, 6 months on death row. Satterfield was convicted in the shooting death of 4-year-old Ray Hudson Jr. He was also charged with killing the boy's parents, Maya Rivera and Ray Hudson Sr. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.